Hi. Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to the Hartman Institute. It's nice to be here. It's nice to welcome you. Thank you for choosing this place as a place to study, as a home to think and to struggle and to deal with some of the more complex and interesting issues facing Jewish life in the modern world. In the tradition of the Institute, I'm not going to at all speak about the conference. We're going to start doing the conference, and we'll speak about it afterwards. Do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? Just as a show, whoever asked a rabbi that question? Pretty interesting. Or how many of you asked somebody else? You don't have to raise your head. Or how many of you thought about that question? It would be interesting, just file it. How many Muslims ask themselves the question, do you have to believe in God in order to be a good Muslim? Or do you have to believe in God in order to be a good Christian? Over the conference, we're going to think about why this is a question that concerns so many Jews. But tonight I'd like to try to address this question. But first, I want to speak a little bit about the culture, not of anybody in this room, but the culture of many of those outside of this room who ask that question. Very often when they ask that question, there is an assumption, in particular when you ask the rabbi, that don't you dare answer to me. Do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? Don't you dare say yes. Don't you dare give an answer which might not give to me the category, or somehow deny from me the category of good Jew. Part of the culture behind this question is the assumption of many, if not most Jews, that they have an inalienable right to be considered a good Jew, and that there is nobody in position of power or not who should be allowed to say to the contrary. Now, there's a number of reasons for this culture. One of them is actually conceptual, which we'll speak about further. And that is a conflation of the terms Jew with good Jew. Because can you be a Jew without believing in God? Sure. Of course you can. Jewishness is a mode of being, not merely a mode of doing. And as a result, no lack of behavior can undermine the maximal status of my beingness. And if to be, the only criteria is, are you breathing? And if you're breathing, or at best, if you really want to push it, if you're having kids, then you're being Jewish. You're enabling the existence of Jewishness by being Jewish. Therefore, you're by definition, by mere being, a good Jew. But Judaism is not simply a system of being. It's also a system of doing. And as a result, the conflation of Jew with good Jew, the association and the translation or the perception that these terms are synonymous, actually creates a problem. Because to what extent does doing as a core dimension of Jewishness have a permanent place within the consciousness of our people and not just being? More than that, if by definition every Jew has an inalienable right to be defined as a good Jew, then what we have done is that we have removed from our conversation the ability of criticism and, even more deeply, the notion of aspiration. Because if by merely getting up in the morning, regardless of what you do, you are a good Jew, and no one could say otherwise, what you have done is you've removed any critics from our midst, appointed people whose jobs it is to congratulate you. And the minute criticism and aspiration is removed from the conversation of Jewishness, mediocrity is a permanent condition. And what we have to ask ourselves is, are we happy with that answer? Are we happy with the reality in which we have created a community which, by definition, will only be able to reach mediocrity? Independent of how you answer this question, because culturally and structurally, we have built a community to think in these terms. I'm a good Jew, and don't you say otherwise. And don't you do anything otherwise. And regardless of where I go, regardless of what I do, or regardless of what I don't do or don't believe, nothing will ever change. You find for me one aspect of life that you would that same definition should apply. And I will point to you to an aspect of life which you want to have no part in. So as we begin to think about this question, and as I said, I'm not talking obviously to anybody in this room. Them out there who ask this question are trying to immunize. Part of the culture behind the question is to immunize the Jewish community from the possibility of aspiration and the possibility of criticism in the best sense of the term. But now let's go to the question. Do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? Has two categories to it. The question has two aspects. The first is, do I have to believe in God? And the issue is therefore believe in God. And the second question, the second term that we have to explain is the term good Jew. And in my remarks, I'd like to take both of those categories and try to analyze them, explain them, and look at various meanings and see, as a result of that, whether we can progress along these lines. Let's start with the term good Jew. What does the term good Jew mean? What do we mean by that? First, as I said beforehand, it's critical to distinguish between good Jew and Jew. And I don't have to elaborate further. But more than that, one of the reasons behind this question, and one of the ways in which we understand the term good Jew as a term that's synonymous with good person. And therefore the question is, one way of looking at it, because a very common definition of what is a good Jew, a good person. Do I have to believe in God in order to be a good person? Now here, the answer is actually quite simple. While in every issue, it depends who you ask, but the dominant culture of our tradition is that you don't have to believe in God in order to be a good person. One of the features of Jewish religion, not all features of it, but one of the key features of it, is that ethics is independent of faith. And that ethics is independent of religion to the extent that religion must mirror the ethical, it doesn't determine the ethical. In your readings, if you want, there's an article that I wrote on this for further reflection afterwards. But the classical example that many of you know, the Abraham who stands up in front of God in Genesis chapter 18 and says to God, will the God of the whole earth not deal justly? Basically assuming that what God does is not by definition just. That means justice is something that God must comply to, just like a human being does. And when Shimon ben Shetach, a famous early Tana in the Rabbinic period, is asked a question about why he wants to return a lost property to an idolat, to a heathen, and his students say, you don't need to, Jewish law doesn't require it, he gets up and says, what do you think, I'm a barbarian? Quoting intentionally a Greek term, barbaroun, intentionally a Greek term, saying that my moral responsibility doesn't grow from halacha. My moral responsibility doesn't grow from within my particular tradition. My particular tradition has value only to the extent that it mirrors a universal moral duty and a universal moral standard. Does one have to believe in God in order to be a good person? The answer is almost unequivocally, if you ask me, no. You don't have to believe in God in order to be a good person. Now, it's possible that belief in God can be conducive to being a good person. It's also possible that believing in God could be conducive to you being a bad person. God could be a force for good. God could be, love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord your God, where the fact that God obligates the good, the fact that we create a ritual system which motivates one and places the good before one's eyes more often, could be catalysts for doing the good. Religion might be conducive to creating a good person. Faith in God may be conducive. We also know that faith in God may be conducive to creating an individual who ignores their moral duty, under the notion that universal ethics is inferior to what my obligation of faith requires, and uses God as a shield to protect oneself and one's behavior from one's moral conscience. But even in the event that one believes that more often than not, belief in God is conducive to that, and it's an interesting question. I was just reading, I apologize, at my age now I'm forgetting certain things. The book called God is the Problem, where tells the story about, again, I apologize, I'll remember his name tomorrow, where Dennis Prager asks him, if you encounter a group of people in a dark night at 2 o'clock at night, and you just heard they're coming from a house of worship, and you met another group of people who you didn't know that about, the fact that you heard that they're coming from a house of worship, wouldn't that make you more relaxed? And his answer was, depends in which city. He says, let's just pick B's. I'll just go for, let's not get too common, let's just go with B's. Beirut? If I just heard that they were coming, Baghdad? Beit Lechem? And he starts going on. He says, Belgrade? He says, actually, just on the B's, I'm not so sure. Whether if I heard that you're coming, Bosnia, I don't even have to go to the Z's or the W's. I can even at B already stop by saying, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure. So, but even assuming that we get out of the B's and we all agree somehow that at least when it comes to the letter C, cities with C's in it are really good places. And if you believe the people who believe in God there are really good people. It's not necessary. And therefore, can one be a good person without believing in God? The answer is yes. Now let's go back to our question. Can one be a good Jew without believing in God? The first stage would be to ask whether to be a good person and to be a good Jew are synonymous terms. Now here too, in one sense, a dominant feature of our tradition seems to answer in the affirmative. In your source book, this is just for your reference afterwards. When someone comes before Hillel and asks him, teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot, basically asking, tell me the essence of your tradition. What's the core of what it means to be a good Jew? And Hillel answers, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. The rest is commentary, go and study. What he's basically saying, the essence of Judaism, the core of this tradition is the way you treat other human beings. That's the core. All the rest is commentary. All the rest is either secondary, and if you don't explain commentary as secondary, you explain it as this must be the interpretive principle through which you live all of your religious life, by which we argue that there could be nothing. You can never allow ritual or faith to override your moral principles. And that must be the interpretive tool through which you determine all of your conflicts in life. Then the core of being a Jew is to be a good person. That's what we want from you. That doesn't mean that everyone who's a good person is a Jew. But everyone who's a Jew, who's a good person, is a good Jew. They're not completely synonymous, because there's still criteria of birth, conversion, membership. But if you are a Jew and a good person, under this logic, following Hillel, the answer would be, again, in the affirmative. If you're a good person, and if you're a Jewish person who's a good person, yes, dayenu, you're a good Jew. Because that's the essence. Now the question is whether Judaism is reducible to the ethical. It's one thing to speak about the primacy of the ethical. It's a different thing to speak about the self-sufficiency of the ethical. Ethics might be primary, but they don't exhaust all of Judaism. Hillel says, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. The rest is commentary. Go and study. Now, what's that go and study? What's all that other stuff that's there? It's possible and very plausible to argue that ethics might be central, but there's much more to Judaism than just that. As Rashi, the commentator, the 10th, 11th century commentator on the Talmud, says to Hillel, basically, oops, you forgot something. Who'd you forget out of the story? When you were defining the essence of Judaism and you said, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others, Hillel, I think you forgot somebody. What about God? And so he interprets what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others, as what's hateful unto God, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto God. And just as you don't like it when people don't listen to you, so too God doesn't like it when you don't listen to God. Flips it around because he says, you can't reduce Judaism to the ethical. Look at our 10 Commandments. There are core moral principles in our 10 Commandments. With which commandment do the core moral principles start? The 6th. The first 5, before you get there, is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. No more gods, no idolatry, don't curse God, act God. There's a lot of God stuff in our tradition. When God takes the Jewish people out of Egypt in Genesis chapter 6, God doesn't say, oh, people, I've heard you're suffering. This is phenomenal. I'm going to take you out of Egypt so that you could be good people. God says, I'm going to take you out of Egypt so that you can what? You shall be my people and I will be your God. I would even argue, however, that even if Judaism is not reducible to the ethical and not exhausted by the ethical, the mere notion of the primacy of the ethical could be sufficient to make a plausible argument that a Jew who's a good person is a good Jew. under the notion that there might be many ways to be a good Jew. And if ethics is so primary, even if there's lots of other things, now it could be that a person who believes in God could also be a good Jew. Now, could a person who believes in God and is an SOB be a good Jew? Probably not. Who says that? All of the prophets, just almost like with a needle, stick it in the page and open it up. Isaiah 58. What are you fasting for? Who asked this of you? You want a day of fasting? Treat your neighbors with justice. What are you coming up? Isaiah chapter 2. What are you showing up at the temple again for? You're making me nauseous. I don't want to see you. Who asked you to come? Who asked them to come? God did, but God forgot. Who asked you to come? I don't want you to be here. What I want you to do is I want you to create a society of justice. Over and over and over again in prophets, in Isaiah, in the Psalms, in Amos, in Micha. You see it throughout the prophets. Open it up. Even if religion is not reducible to the ethical, and it's not self-sufficient, an argument could still be made, or it's made all the time, that ritual behavior without the ethical is completely inadequate, which would at least give plausible grounds to again answering. Could somebody be a good Jew without believing in God? The answer would again be yes. Doesn't mean that there's not other stuff, but can you achieve goodness? Is there enough there? If this is primary, then the answer is again yes. I'd like to come back to this notion in a few moments. But go now for a few minutes to the other side of the question. Belief in God. Do I have to believe in God, which is part of in order to be a good Jew? Now, when the person is saying, do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? In general, this is not a person who sees themselves as what? As a believer in God. Unless they're asking for their children or for their friend. Not for me, it's just my friend. I have a friend who, It's like we rabbis are like doctors. People ask us questions for other people, if it ever happened. What is it that you don't believe in? For today's conversation, let's distinguish between three types of non-belief, three types of atheism. And the atheist is the one who it means like to be without a deity. Let's distinguish between positive atheism, negative atheism, and practical atheism. Positive atheism is the explicit affirmation that God does not exist. Negative atheism is to be a non-theist. It's not a positive affirmation that God doesn't exist, but I don't have a belief, or I don't have an articulated belief, and as a result, the absence of that articulated belief makes me a negative atheist. It's a softer term. The third is a practical atheist. It's the one who lives a life as if there is no God. They might ascribe to, if they ask, do you believe in God? Yeah. What difference does that make? None. Do you live in relationship to God? No. Do you expect anything from God? No. There's a functional dimension to practical atheism in which God may exist in theory, but in the actual life of a person, God is not a significant other. Now, for the vast majority of people who ask the question, do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? Very rarely are you going to meet positive atheists. That requires a lot of work. And in general, there are, again, I'm not speaking statistically, what I said, whatever percentage there are atheists. How many are really, yes, I'm certain I have a positive, there is no God. Happens. Not that often. In most cases, you're going to meet either negative atheists or practical atheists. And very, very often, the most predominant is practical atheism. In fact, in the Jewish community, we are a profoundly practical atheist community. The significance of practical atheism in the life of Jews is staggering. And amongst other religious communities in America, it's not, in the United States, I can't speak about Canada, it's just remarkable. The level of God's insignificance. How many Jews are members of synagogues? How many Jews who are members of synagogues attend regularly? When you ask that question outside of the Orthodox community, I don't think you're going to go beyond 5% regular attendance. 5% regular attendance. Now, if it was that there was a huge move of I learned the community, what is it called? The word, the people who do it on their own, the IPs, what are they called again? The DIYers. Now, if do it yourself. Thank you. Do it yourself. Right. It took me 15 years to learn NIMBY, so but now I'm going to be such a knacker. DIYers. I'll feel like really like the insider. Anyway, only a DIYer, not just chalishing for someone to say, "What's that?" Anyway, the DIYers, the do-it-yourselfers. Now, if the do-it-yourselfers were this huge spiritual community praying up Narishka. We're just not praying, functionally. Oh, we might embrace God, as most people do, at moments of personal crisis. And no criticism of the inconsistency is intended. It's perfectly legitimate. When you're in trouble, if anything could get you through the day, use it. Fantastic. It would be stupid not to. But outside of your moment of crisis, is God that which people feel is dramatically significant in their life? The chancellor of JTS, phenomenal man, Arnie Eisen, one of the most innovative and really courageous thinkers in the American Jewish community. Beautiful man, phenomenal man. So I want to define the essence of conservative Judaism as the notion of mitzvah. What defines the conservative movement is a community which believes that mitzvah is the central defining feature of who we are. In JTS, as he thought about this, it was phenomenal. Amongst the group of people who he talked to, this will be transformational. Then he goes out to the field to live under the notion that I'm commanded by God. We're practical atheists. Mitzvah, I feel that God commands me. God doesn't command me. The practical atheism of the Jewish community is very dominant. So the first thing we have to look at when we're talking about, do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? What is the non-belief that we're speaking about? The same answer could be given to either. Even for positive atheism, if you're a good person and to be a good and a Jew who's a good person is a good Jew, I could still come with the same answer. But part of what we need to do is to find out what are the boxes that we've created for ourselves which generate the question in the first place. Very often, one of the things that happens is that people believe that in order to be a theist, I have to believe A. But since I can't believe A, therefore, or I don't care about A, therefore, I'm not what? I'm not a theist, and therefore I'm an atheist, and therefore I'm nudging my rabbi, could I be a good Jew without believing in God? What happens, for example, if many of the things that you think you had to believe in which you don't believe in, you didn't have to believe in? Then from the beginning, the question wouldn't even be that compelling, not that doesn't mean that the answer wouldn't be the same. Like what would happen, for example, if you said, I'm sorry, I can't believe that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Don't buy it. And I don't even need to go to Auschwitz. It's just not that complicated. I just have to watch TV on Africa. I don't have to be, I don't even have that complex. I can even look at my own life. Too much stuff has gone on. God, I'm not buying you as the savior of the righteous and the punisher of the wicked. Sorry, don't buy into it. And in order to be a believer in God, that's what you have to believe in. And since I can't believe in that, therefore what? I don't believe in God. But what happens if a dominant position in our tradition already argues the world pursues its natural course? God doesn't shape history. Now, are you going to call Rabbi Akiva an atheist? Or are you going to, all of a sudden, what is it that I have to believe might change? Or what happens if I don't want to, the notion of being commanded is not central. That's not a motive. I don't feel it. I want to be commanded. Get off my back. I don't like this notion of an authority figure breathing down my back and, I know it does a lot of stuff on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, God's sitting there watching everything we're doing and we get really nervous for 25 hours. And then we somehow get over it, but it's like this safety insurance policy, if in the event that they're, all the above. It's like, as you all know, I mention all the time, Pascal's theory on why it's rational to believe in God. If God doesn't exist and you believed in God, you wasted some time. If God exists and you didn't believe in God, I have a few chapters of the Bible to tell you what happens to such people. And therefore, it's much more rational for you to hedge your bet. And therefore, it's rational. So that basically, for the practical atheists of the Jewish community, defines our Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur experiences. We are Pascalian theists 25 hours, and then we fall back into our practical atheism. But what happens if to be commanded is not an essential feature? It's interesting. What happens if the highest feature of Jewish life is similar to what Maimonides argues, and you'll see it on your own here in the text in chapter Chelek, that the highest level of worship is to internalize Torah to the extent that you do the commandments and refrain from the prohibitions because you feel that in so doing you are fulfilling the human potential within you. That the highest level, Maimonides says human beings shouldn't be like donkeys. Donkeys, they have bridles and bit, whatever they're called, motivating them, guiding you. It's from the outside. For a human being, it should be from the inside. So it's possible that a lot of the angst motivating the question, do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew because I've defined myself as someone who doesn't believe, that actually by opening up the conversation, it's going to be one of our goals this week, by opening up the possibilities in the discussion for a multiple, more complex notion of what faith may mean, that I might be far more in the story than I thought that I was out of the story. And the dichotomy between believing in God, good Jew, ethics, all of that stuff, the white, black, in, out, singular, dichotomous categories, that's just shallow. And that itself is creating mediocrity in my own life. So do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? First, it's very possible that a lot of those who believe that they don't believe actually believe. I don't mean here a paternalistic sense. I don't mean by saying, you really believe, you just don't know. No, I don't go for that. When someone says they don't believe, I take it they don't believe. I don't know what you are. But it's very possible that you're locked into a pediatric notion of God which you should have given up a long time ago. And actually, Judaism has a far more diverse sensibility and sensitivity about faith, in which a life with God, which you've locked yourself out of, is open to you. And you're a prisoner of your own construction or of your own ignorance. That's possible. But even if you are a positive atheist, can you be a good Jew and not believe in God? My answer is probably yes. Because goodness is so primary that it at least has to be sufficient. However, I want to ask you a little harder question. There is a distinction between a Jew and a good Jew. But there is even a more interesting distinction. And that is between a good Jew and a great Jew. Now, what does great Jew mean? For some, you could make good Jew and great Jew synonymous. But then you are, through the impoverishment of your language, impoverishing your potential to experience. One of the features of greatness is that I would say the definition of greatness that I feel most inspired by is the notion of greatness is that which you could never achieve. If you have a definition of greatness which is achievable, there's something wrong with your categories. Greatness is something like wisdom. And as Socrates teaches us, that I am wise to the extent that I know that I do not know, so too I am great to the extent that I know that I am not great. If I see myself as great, you're probably mediocre. I think parents should tell kids they're great. But parents, that's their job. Because we want to develop in our children a sense of love, acceptance, to give them the inner confidence to always believe that they can. And the hindrance to greatness is not only the belief that you've achieved it, but sometimes the greater hindrance to greatness is the belief that you're not even a player. And then you give up. If greatness is a journey, it requires people to walk on that journey. And the question is whether you are a journeyer or not is the real interesting question. And parents have a role to play in helping us go on that journey. And one of the ways they do it is they have to build up our sense of self. And I will always, forever and ever, be in debt of my mother till my dying day, who, regardless of how low we fell, always made us feel that we were great. Always. Always. And as a child who was ADHD, failing in school pre-Ritalin, that was pretty important. Nobody else, they're stupid. And so I believed. And I never felt that I can't be on that journey. Great, huge gift that my mother gave to all of her children. It's a gift that could never be repaid, ever be repaid. And had a profound impact on the life of every one of her children. But other than that, it's one thing for your parent to think you're great. It's another thing to believe that you are great. To think that you've achieved it. What we have to ask ourselves is we have to write a new book. And that book might be called, I don't know, it's just coming to me right now, From Good to Great. But in a different sense. How do we move from being good Jews to great Jews? Now, a great Jew, one of the questions you have to ask yourself deep in your soul is, do you need somebody else to say that you're a great Jew? Is it enough that they say you're a good Jew? If you need them to say you're a great Jew, you're not great. You're actually quite mediocre. You're very, very frail. And I appreciate it. But it's not a rabbi who you have to consult. You really have to consult a therapist. In a very positive sense. No negativity approach. If that's what you need, then you've locked yourself into a path of mediocrity which is unworthy of you. Do I have to believe in God in order to be a great Jew? My answer is probably yes. Or probably. Could someone be a great Jew if one's a great person? Maybe. Could be. The Hasidic literature is filled with the person who inherits, in our tradition, there's a person who inherits the whole world in one moment. There are these things which just define you and change everything about you, and you get to the finish line with that one thing which is so superior, that great moment. Very few people are at that great moment. The path of greatness is a path of adding more and more dimensions to your life. The ones that ask you, what else do I have? What other doors could I open? Does a life with God, touched by God, feeling loved by God, feeling challenged by God, feeling inspired by God, feeling God's kindness and warmth, feeling God's motivation, create another dimension to what it means to be a human being? The answer is clearly yes. Whether you've experienced it or not doesn't mean that something profound is not happening. When a human being is able to transcend oneself and to feel at one with a transcendent being, does something happen to such an individual? When you meet those people who walk with God, is there a song they're singing which you may be deaf to, and which is a beautiful song? The answer is yes. To define greatness which doesn't add the potential of the value of a life of faith as an aspect of creating a fuller life would be to rob the human condition of some of its most essential experiences. Here, by the way, it's even more important to make sure that you transcend the pediatric notion of God, because it's also very possible that because you believe that in order to believe in God, you have to believe A, and since you can't believe A, you don't believe in God, that therefore you close the door on a conversation of God, with God in your life, which could have been a conversation that you were available for, and that God was available. There's something could have happened, but you locked yourself in grade 4. Or you put in earplugs and couldn't hear. Now it could be you would have never heard, but it could be you could have. It could be that a frustration with a God who commands doesn't mean that you're not open to a God who is a partner with you in your life. It could be that a frustration with a God who rewards and punishes doesn't mean that you don't have an experience of God's being. Just there. Just there. And to glimpse at it, to feel it from time to time. makes all the difference. But you were just too angry or too locked up somewhere that it just wasn't available to you. And it's one of those cases where theological pluralism is not necessary in order for you to be more menschlich to somebody else, but where theological pluralism is necessary for you to be more menschlich to yourself. Can you be a great Jew and not believe in God? Maybe. Maybe. But if greatness is not something that you are, but something that you aspire to be, then the answer is probably no. Probably no. Because there's pathways and music and voices that unfortunately you're just not attuned to. You could be a good Jew. But my bracha to all of us as we start this conference, and as we start a week of thinking about the serious complexities of what does it mean to be a believer in the modern world? How do I deal with my most inner and deepest struggles? My bracha to you is that you should want to be great, but never, ever, ever need someone to say that you are. We have to have a complex, multifaceted definition of greatness, which is always pushing us. And we rob our community when we don't put faith and issues of faith, at least as an aspiration. As an aspiration. Why can't you have it as an aspiration? What does it take from you to have an aspiration other than to say, I am not all that I ought to be? Is defines ought when Jewishness is being. When Jewishness is doing, is defines is. Ought is the challenge of a lifetime. Thank you. Now I'm happy to take some questions. Please.
I'd like to add one other thought that I was thinking while you were talking. And that's the element of particularism in a society, in a world of universalism. And to achieve that greatness, one has to also understand and begin to feel that there is value to have particularism. Because if you don't have one own particularism, then there's no way of ever translating it to universalism. And that's the forces that we run into all the time. Sure. Just look outside our tradition. I'm just thinking the Dalai Lama came to visit San Diego. He has a particularism which is very defined, and look how his values are so universal. He's not ashamed, he's not afraid of putting that out there. And I think so many in the Jewish community in the diaspora, particularly the United States, they feel that particularism is bad, it's dangerous. Globalization, universalism, that's where I want to be.
I'm right with you. The only thing I would recommend this week is that's another seminar. Particularism, universalism, it's another one. This week, let's hold this issue itself. Just let it be there. But you're right, there's multiple facets to how one adds more and more nuances to one's life so that greatness is at least a journey that's possible. Thank you. Any other questions, please? Yes, please, ma'am.
I remember learning in Maya, and probably a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, but one of the quotes that stuck with me from one of my modern Maya classes, for people who aren't from Boston, Maya is a 100-hour
100 hours of Jewish
learning.
Adult learning.
A quote that the early secular Zionists knew what the God they didn't believe in expected of them. And I was wondering if you could comment on that quote. For some reason that stuck with me, and that seems
No, it's very much, that's why the last lecture that we're having here in this conference is what's the God you don't believe in? And our hope is to put forth lots of gods you don't believe in so that you could begin the journey of the God you don't believe in, but there's actually a God that you can believe in other words, and that they're not the same. Again, it's part of the prison. Part of the prison of early Zionists was that they locked themselves away from so many treasures which could have enriched their conversation because they were so angry that God is the God that Judaism, not just God, is that which they don't believe in, and they defined it in such particular terms. And Israeli society to this day has a strong sense of people being locked away from something because this is, I can't go there because that's the God I don't believe in, with ever asking themselves, so no. Is that all? Is that it? That was, and when you define God by the God you don't believe in, or Judaism by that which you can't accept, you end up robbing yourself of something that could enrich you. And it's chaval. Yes, please, sir.
The language that you used was binary. It was, do you believe in God or don't you believe in God? And I know my own experience is that my belief ebbs and flows. Often I couldn't tell you.
Sure. I wasn't, I'm talking about a binary at any given moment. It could ebb and flow, and I was, obviously for somebody who, part of the dimension of the difference between positive atheism, negative atheism, practical atheism, allows for that different dimension. I was just addressing at that given moment. Is it critical, as we're starting now our conversation on faith, is how I walk within this door going to define to what extent I could be an adequate player in this tradition? Now, when you come in and out, obviously a life is judged by much greater complexity, but sometimes going to that moment, it's a very, very important moment. And recognizing that the conversation of faith and the conversation about being a good Jew and the conversation of faith and the conversation about being a great Jew, all of them are basically what we're going to be speaking about, what I hope your souls are open to. And you're right, we as human beings are never just stuck at one moment. That's what makes us so interesting. The much more complicated question that no one ever asks is, Rabbi, you ask, Rabbi, could I be a good Jew if I don't believe in God? You don't ask, Rabbi, I struggle with the issue, and from time to time I don't believe. Could I still be a good? You don't. It's, but that nuance is obviously is descriptive much more of the complexity of human life. So thank you. Yes, please, sir.
A similar question might be: do I have to believe in Torah in order to be a good Jew? And one of the thoughts that you sort of jostled is that in Parsha Netzavim, it talks about blessing oneself in their own heart as they feel they walk in their own ways and what God will then do to them. So there's also this issue of how to deal with the literalism of the Torah.
Sure. The same, if I would give a similar lecture, I would have to break down, do I have to believe in Torah? What does belief in Torah mean? Does belief in Torah mean belief in the divine origin of the Torah? Does belief in Torah mean that the divine origin of the Torah was in the 13th century BCE? There's so many. Belief in Torah doesn't mean that I believe in Torah as the only good. Belief in Torah doesn't mean that Torah obligates me all the time. Even there too, it's again one of those belief-ins which is so much more complicated and needs to be unpacked, where to again there's so much more variety and potential within the category when, again, like I can't, so like one of the classic ones is, and so you have to believe that God wrote the Torah in the 13th century and that BCE and every single word in it is perfect and applicable forever and ever and ever. If that's belief in Torah, Shalom Aleichem. You know what I mean? It's like, but there too, part of the process of freeing us to have richer conversations about what we believe, and then what we use to construct how we understand good to great Judaism, is about unpacking these categories and enabling a far more richer conversation with them. But thank you. Yes, please.
We've been talking around the definition of belief. You know, Yoram Hazoni thinks the idea of belief in the existence of God is really a Christian kind of category, whereas, you know, then he focuses on the belief on whether God is really going to fulfill. More Jewish definition would be, do you believe that God's really going to fulfill his obligations to you in the covenant? So, I mean, is there an ambiguity right now, or are we going to talk about a definition of belief and it's not just a single idea?
The one thing, of course we're going to, the one thing that I would caution you, and I caution people to this all the time, anytime you hear somebody speak about Judaism and Christianity, run. Run as fast as you can, because it's just not true. The Jewish belief, there's probably no more false, if you had to put three words together, which are probably by definition the most inaccurate, only the Christian belief would come pretty close. It's part of work is it's not the Jew. There's so many beliefs, so many possibilities, that belief in God is Christian, belief with God in the covenant is Jewish. Yeah. I don't know if this person ever read Maimonides, for example, just as an example, and I think Maimonides is Jewish. Last I checked, unless some people claim he was Muslim. So it's just, what I'm saying is that it's just as a but are we going to, and are you? The question is not what we're only going to do in this seminar. The question is what you're going to do. Your lecturers aren't going to speak about Judaism says, I promise you, and if any of them do, tell me. Because it'll probably be the last time they're ever going to lecture at the Hartman Institute. Tell me. I don't know Judaism says. They won't say that. But what they're going to do is they're going to talk about dimensions of Judaism as we look at different dilemmas and struggles about what faith means and what is it about and what are we believing in and how we live with different dimensions of doubt and faith and struggles, etc. And what are the implications of that? What you're going to do with it in the spirit of the Hartman Institute is the most interesting question. Because at the end of the day, what you believe and how you construct your Jewish life and your life of faith is one thing and one thing only, your business.
I don't understand how you can be a great Jew and think Darwin was right.
Say this to me.
Which is to say, I was surprised in your...
Say it to me. Say it again, please.
Okay, I can understand why you can be a good Jew and not believe in God. That's possible, as you said. I'm not sure you can be a great Jew, which is to assume some kind of belief in God, while also believing Darwin was right. That is, I was struck in your talk how you didn't bring in science and
That's because that's tomorrow's lecture.
that's tomorrow.
But as a precursor, I sure hope that you could be or aspire to be a great Jew and believe that Darwin was right, because if you don't, we're really in drear. We're like, which is a technical term in Greek for we're in trouble. Because I sure hope that I think that Darwin was right. And I hope that that belief is not closing off from me by definition. The ability, I hope not, but I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow. The issue of science. Today was about, can I be a good Jew? And I think there was one last question, and with that we'll conclude. Oh, there were two, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
I appreciate what you were saying about the need to start by being a good person, and that's kind of an ethical situation that is widely understood. But it seems to me that the reason for that, the reason it is widely understood, and the basis of that, and what gives it its power, is its religious component, which has been added to over, eons of human life. And it seems to me that the process of attrition of that general understanding and the primacy of it is part of the current 21st century issues, and that the business of going from adequate Jew, which is to say an ethical person, to being a great Jew, ought to include the fact that you are putting value back into the communal good, which again is a religious issue, and for Jews probably has a lot to do with belief in God. I mean, that is what gives it its power, and I can't see that there's any other basis for it, for the general sense of what it takes to be an ethical person.
Fair enough. On that, you and I disagree, and that's just fine. I do.
Well, we would disagree or would not?
Oh, we absolutely would.
We would disagree.
And it would be a
Okay.
perfectly legitimate disagree. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying in the spirit of the Institute, like very clear, we're not about ironing out differences. Quite to the contrary. You are very intelligent. I hear you, and that voice is very, very loud. I do believe that the foundation of the ethical is not in faith. Is not in faith. The foundation of the ethical is not in religion. I don't think it came from there at all, no. I think, and if you want to, again, I have an article which I handed out to you, which traces the debate within this Jewish tradition on this position, and that's why I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you're representing a clear voice within the tradition. I was arguing for a different one. If we do follow the position that you are ascribing to, and it's a perfectly legitimate and intelligent one, disagreement doesn't mean a devalidization outside of the American political discourse. No, we could disagree with respect in that sense, that when you do make that decision, and that's why I made the statement, if to be a good person, that's why I started with, if good person is a requirement of faith, then obviously you also can't be a good Jew without faith. But if good personhood is not dependent on faith, as I believe the dominant, or at least an equally major position within the Jewish tradition, then you open the door to answering the question, could you be a good Jew without believing in God? In the affirmative, under the assumption that a good person that a Jew who's a good person becomes a good Jew. But if we argue, as you are arguing, perfectly legitimately, then the answer would be very different, and therein a legitimate disagreement lies. Thank you. Last question, please.
I think this is a very important conversation for individual Jews to aspire to. But we're experiencing in North America that many people who don't have a core, and maybe refer to it as the beginnings of pediatric Judaism, but this conversation in a liberal setting to people who are here already is an important conversation. My concern is if without the core belief system, and that another generation of Jews will not be engaging in this conversation because they don't have the core to refer back to. They're going to be talking about great personhood.
That is another conversation. One of the questions which you might want to think about, and what this will conclude, is faith in God necessary for Jewish continuity? That's another conversation. That's another conversation. my answer probably would be no. Because the term necessary, again, but I might make a distinction between necessary and conducive. In other words, the categories are the conversation. I'm inviting you to a very subtle, these issues are subtle. And be very, very careful. Very, very careful. It's not dissimilar to, if you don't have two Jewish parents, is there going to be any future to the Jewish people? And a lot of people with a lot of clarity are going to get up and say, no chance. And all of a sudden, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to look down at their belly button and basically say, what? Oops, someone just did what? Someone just closed the door on me. And therefore, I'm not saying you can't make necessary claims. You can make any of them you want to, personally. I'm saying just think them through. And therefore, there's differences. Is faith in God necessary in order for Jewish continuity? Have the same conversation again. What does faith in God mean? Are you talking about positive atheism, negative atheism, practical atheism? What is it that you think is going to break the chain? That's going to make the system fall apart? What is it? Put it on the table. What is it that's going to save it? What is it that you want? What is it that you're going to argue for? Because one of the interesting features is that the mere claim that without that we're not going to continue doesn't constitute an argument anymore. It's only an argument which causes those who are on the inside to mourn. It doesn't cause any of those on the outside to join. Right? So then you have to even ask the question, how even productive is that conversation? But that's a whole other one. But be very careful about essentialist notions. Because one of the features of our generation, we're going to speak about this more tomorrow, is that the minute you find an essential category that you believe is the key, you're going to have to start dealing with masses of Jews who don't believe and agree with your essential category. And part of what the modern world challenges all of us is to exit our comfort zone and to recognize that there's going to be a lot of Jews who are going to be good Jews in ways that are very, very different than the way we were good Jews. And the secret to Jewish continuity is one thing, or one thing I know will make Jewish continuity impossible. And that is that if you assume that the definition of good Jew is a static one, and that what you defined as a good is going to be the one it's going to shift. And look, even today, how many of you asked yourself that question? Do I have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? How many of you asked this of your rabbi? And now go back 300 years, and you will have found yourselves to be an anomaly. An anomaly. That question wasn't asked. Things have changed. Recognize that in your own life, there has been a shift. Part of what I'm asking you to think about is that can you make distinctions between who you are and who you believe you would like to be? Can you leave a little place within your soul to be attuned to a song that you can't yet appreciate? What a gift. If you could do that, whew, you're on the way from moving from good to great. Laila Tov, thank you and welcome to the Hartman Institute.